If you see an Australian soldier's rucksack lie on the ground, walk away. Do not ask questions. And whatever you do, do not touch it. That was a standing order given to every single American Marine in 1967. One sentence. For words that made zero sense. You're fresh off the bird, boots still red with laterite dust, heart pounding from the ride-in. The jungle is screaming around you, birds, monkeys, insects, and your sergeant grabs you by the collar and whispers that line like it's the 11th commandment. Why? Why would a dirty canvas bag be more dangerous than a tripwire? Why did battle-hardened Marines treat it like it was radioactive? The Americans call them the jungle hobos. They look like they've been dragged through every swamp in Southeast Asia and left to rot in the sun. Uniforms faded to rags. Faces painted with grease and mud until they looked like demons. They smelled like death, rotting meat, fish sauce, weeks of sweat and filth. They could vanish into the tree lean right in front of your eyes, like the jungle simply swallowed them whole. Elite soldiers or just filthy animals? That contradiction is what broke people's minds. One curious helicopter crew chief thought it was all bullshit. He saw a filthy rucksack lying there after patrol came in. Thought, how dangerous can a backpack really be? He reached down, and in the next 3 seconds, he learned the truth the hard way. What he found inside wasn't food. It wasn't ammo. It was absolute proof that the men fighting beside him had stopped being soldiers a long time ago and had become something the Viet Cong feared more than B-52s. Today you will learn the truth that the Pentagon has tried to bury for decades. The truth about people who ceased to be soldiers and became something else. Something that made the Viet Cong's hair stand on end. Something that even the Allies called ghosts of the forest. Stick around. Because by the end of this video, you'll never look at a rucksack the same way again. Captain James Whitfield, U.S. Army Intelligence. Rational. By the book. The kind of officer who still believed the American way of war was unbeatable. He had read every classified file. He knew the kill ratios. He thought he was ready. He wasn't. The moment his boots hit the red dirt of Nui Dat Base in 1967, his entire world split in two. Before Australia and after. The heat was a living thing, pressing down like a wet wool blanket. But the first thing that actually punched him in the face wasn't the heat. It was the smell. It crawled into his nostrils like something alive. Feral. Wrong. His stomach flipped before his brain even processed it. Then they emerged from the tree lean. 5 men. No insignia. Uniforms that looked like they'd been used as rags for a decade. Faces hidden under layers of greasy camouflage paint that made them look like creatures that had crawled out of the swamp and decided to stay. One of them was carrying that rucksack, the one Whitfield had been warned about. It looked like it had been dragged through hell and back, canvas dark with sweat, mud, and God knows what else. Whitfield, good American officer that he was, stepped forward on pure reflex to help the exhausted soldier with his load. Big mistake. A steel grip locked around his arm like a vice. An Australian sergeant, eyes dead, voice quiet, leaned in so close Whitfield could smell the fish sauce on his breath. Never, under any circumstances, touch our gear. That was the moment Captain James Whitfield stopped being an observer and became our eyes. His shock is our shock. His disgust is our disgust. His slow, horrifying transformation is a journey we're all about to take together. Because everything you're about to hear, he lived it. And by the time he left that base 3 weeks later, the man who flew home was not the same man who arrived. This is his story. And through him, it becomes ours. The Americans smell like victory, like home, like civilization. Beef stew, chocolate, cigarettes, aftershave, laundry detergent flown in from the States. They smell like a walking neon sign that screamed, I'm here from 300 meters away. The jungle hated that smell. The Australians understood something the Pentagon never did. The jungle doesn't forgive foreign scent. If you've watched this far, subscribe to see more videos like this. So they weaponized biology itself. 3 to 5 days before every patrol, they stopped washing. Completely. No soap, no toothpaste, no deodorant. They let the bacteria bloom on their skin like a living shield. They changed their diet to match the enemy: rice, dried fish, chili. And the final touch, the stuff that made hardened Marines gag: fish sauce, nuoc ma'am, that fermented Vietnamese nightmare that smells like pure decomposition. They didn't just eat it. They marinated themselves in it from the inside out until their sweat smelled exactly like the local villagers and Viet Cong fighters. It wasn't hygiene. It was biological mimicry at the highest, most disgusting level. Their clothes, boots, rifle slings, everything was soaked in the same filth until the entire patrol smelled like the jungle floor itself. When American patrols moved, the birds exploded into the sky. Monkeys screamed warnings. The jungle announced their arrival like a siren. When the Australians moved, the jungle stayed silent. It accepted them as its own. They had become invisible, not just to eyes, but to noses, to instincts. And that smell, the one that made Captain Whitfield want to vomit on his first day, was the reason dozens of them came home alive. This was the first crack in the American myth of superiority. War isn't about who has the most bombs. It's about who becomes the environment first. And the Australians had already won that war. Captain Whitfield was watching from the ridgeline when it happened. A standard American squad, young, exhausted, cocky, had just finished a patrol. They stopped in a small clearing they thought was safe. Packs hit the ground. Helmets came off. Someone cracked a joke. Blue cigarette smoke curled lazily into the still air. They were maybe 40 meters from the tree line, but in their minds they were already back at base, cold beer in hand. Whitfield smiled. He knew that feeling, the brief illusion of safety. Then the ground moved. Not the wind, not an animal. The earth itself stood up. For meters from the lieutenant's boot, a patch of dead ferns and mud rose slowly, silently, like the jungle had decided to grow a man. It was an Australian SAS operator. He had been sitting there the entire time, perfectly motionless, while an entire American squad walked within inches of him. The Americans didn't just jump. They recoiled like they'd seen a ghost. Weapons flew up. Fingers tightened on triggers. One Marine actually screamed, a short, sharp sound that died in his throat when he realized the swamp creature was on their side. But the fear on their faces was real, because this man did not smell like a human being. He smelled like the rotting floor of the jungle, like wet leaves, mud, and 3 days of fish sauce. His human scent had been erased so completely that even their instincts had filtered him out as background noise. He was invisible not just to their eyes, but to their noses, to their animal brains that should have screamed predator. Whitfield's blood ran cold. Then 4 more bushes stood up around the Americans, one from behind a fallen log, one from a clump of elephant grass, one literally from the mud at their feet. The entire American squad had been completely surrounded by friendly forces for God knows how long. If those 5 shapes had been Viet Cong instead of Australians, the patrol would have been wiped out before they finished their first cigarette. No one spoke for a long second. The lead Australian operator just looked at them with eyes that seemed too old for his 25-year-old face. No smile, no gotcha, just a slow, deliberate hand signal. His team melted back into the greenery like they had never existed. Whitfield stood there, heart hammering, realizing something that shattered every lesson he'd learned at West Point. These men weren't hiding in the jungle. They had become the jungle. And the Americans, with all their firepower, all their technology, all their noise, were the ones who didn't belong. That single moment of humiliation was the turning point. From that second on, no one called them jungle hobos with a smirk anymore. They started calling them something else. Ghosts. And the ghosts were just getting started. This is where the myth became blood. Captain Whitfield was standing 50 meters away, clipboard in hand, when he saw it unfold. The Australian was barely moving. 3 days in the bush, maybe 4. Legs shaking. The rucksack looked heavier than the man carrying it. Canvas stained dark. Straps frayed. Something metallic glinting under the flap. The crew chief did what any decent soldier would do. He stepped forward, reached out, grabbed the shoulder strap to help haul it aboard. He never saw the tripwire. A single, sharp crack. Not a grenade, not a mine, but something small, surgical, personal. The blast was contained. Sharp, cool, It tore through the crew chief's hand like paper. Bone and meat sprayed across the Huey's deck. He flew backward, slamming into the metal floor, screaming once before shock took the sound. The rotors kept turning. The engine whine drowned everything else for a heartbeat. Then silence, the kind that rings. Whitfield ran forward. Medics were already there. The Australian operator didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even look surprised. He simply knelt, checked the rigging on what remained of the pack, secured the flap again like nothing had happened, and climbed aboard. To him, the fault was obvious. The American had broken the rule. Do not touch their packs. It wasn't a suggestion. It was doctrine written in blood. Inside every one of those filthy rucksacks was a philosophy the Americans couldn't stomach. Absolute paranoia, absolute autonomy, absolute lack of trust, even in allies. If the enemy found it, it had to be a trap. If a stranger touched it, it had to be a threat. No exceptions, no courtesy, no margin for human kindness. The charge wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to maim, to teach, to make sure the next curious hand thought twice. Word spread fast. Pilots stopped offering help with gear. Marines stopped joking about the jungle hobos. Commanders issued new standing orders. Stay away from Australian equipment. Do not assist. Do not approach. The distance between allies grew, not from anger, but from cold, survival-based fear. Whitfield watched it all from the edge of the pad, stomach turning. These men weren't just fighting the Viet Cong. They were turning the entire world, including their own possessions, into a kill zone. The rucksack wasn't gear anymore. It was a fortress, a statement, a line drawn in canvas and wire. We trust no one, not even you. And in that moment, Whitfield understood the deepest horror. The ghosts weren't dangerous only to the enemy. They were dangerous to anyone who didn't speak their language. Silence, traps, patience that felt almost inhuman. The rucksack became more than a symbol. It became the physical proof that these men had crossed a line most soldiers never even see. They had accepted a level of ruthlessness that no amount of American firepower could match. And from that day forward, every time an American saw one of those dirty canvas bags lying on the ground, they didn't laugh. They didn't reach out. They walked away. Because now they knew. Inside wasn't just equipment. Inside was the end of innocence. And the ghosts kept walking. This is where the myth turned into blood. Captain Whitfield stood 50 meters away, clipboard in hand, watching the whole thing unfold. The Australian could barely walk. 3, maybe 4 days straight in the bush, legs shaking. The rucksack looked heavier than the man himself. The American crew chief, young, helpful, classic, were all on the same team energy, jumped down from the bird to assist. Pure reflex, human instinct. He reached out, grabbed the shoulder strap to help haul it aboard. He never saw the tripwire. A single sharp crack, not a grenade, not a claymore, something small, surgical, personal. The blast was contained, precise, vicious. It shredded the crew chief's hand like wet paper. Bone fragments and meat sprayed across the Huey's aluminum deck. The man was thrown backward, slamming spine first into the metal floor. One short, raw scream, then shock stole the sound. For one heartbeat, the rotors kept turning. The engine whine swallowed everything. Then silence, the ringing kind. Whitfield sprinted forward. Medics were already there. The Australian operator didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even look surprised. He simply dropped to one knee, calmly checked the remaining rigging on what was left of the pack, secured the flap again like routine maintenance, and climbed aboard as if the last 10 seconds had never happened. To him, the fault was obvious. The American had broken the rule. Do not touch their packs. It wasn't advice. It wasn't a suggestion. It was doctrine written in blood. Inside every one of those filthy, sweat-soaked rucksacks lived a philosophy the Americans could not digest. Absolute paranoia, absolute autonomy, absolute zero trust, even toward allies. If the enemy ever found it, it had to be booby-trapped. If a stranger touched it, it had to become a threat. No exceptions. No, we're on the same side. No room for human kindness. The charge wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to maim, to teach, to make damn sure the next curious hand hesitated. Word spread like shrapnel. Pilots stopped offering to help load gear. Marines stopped cracking jokes about jungle hobos. Commanders issued crisp new standing orders overnight. Stay away from Australian equipment. Do not assist. Do not approach. The gap between allies widened, not from anger, but from cold, survival mathematics. Whitfield watched from the edge of the pad, stomach turning. These men weren't just fighting the Viet Cong. They were turning everything into a kill zone, including their own possessions. The rucksack was no longer gear. It was a fortress, a declaration, a line drawn in stained canvas and piano wire. We trust no one, not even you. And in that exact moment, Whitfield understood the deepest horror. The ghosts weren't dangerous only to the enemy. They were dangerous to anyone who didn't speak their language. Silence, traps, a patience that felt almost inhuman. The rucksack became more than a symbol. It became physical proof that these men had crossed a line most soldiers never even see. They had accepted because now they knew inside wasn't just equipment. Inside was the end of innocence. Whitfield couldn't sleep after the rucksack incident. Every night the same image, that crew chief's hand exploding across the Huey deck. Every night the same question burned hotter. Who the hell are these men? So he did what any good intelligence officer would do. He started digging. What he found in the classified after-action reports made him sit back in his chair and stare at the canvas wall for a full minute. By late 1967, the average American kill ratio in Vietnam was roughly 10-1. 10 enemy dead for every American life lost. Grim, brutal, but expected in a war of attrition. Then he turned the page to the Australian SAS section. The numbers were written in plain black type, no flourish, no explanation. 500-1. 500 enemy killed for every Australian lost. Whitfield actually laughed out loud the first time he saw it. A short, nervous bark that died in the humid air. He thought it was a typo. He checked the date. He checked the unit. He checked it 3 more times. It wasn't a typo. A force that never exceeded 150 operators at any one time in Phuoc Thi province was producing results entire American brigades with thousands of men, artillery, and air support couldn't touch. How? The answer wasn't in their rifles. The Australians often carried less firepower than a standard Marine squad. The answer wasn't in their radios or helicopters. Half the time they turned the radios off completely. The answer was in something the Pentagon had never budgeted for and never wanted to admit existed. Philosophy. The Americans fought the war they wanted to fight. A war of noise, steel, and overwhelming industrial power. B-52s turning mountains into gravel. Napalm painting the sky orange. Helicopters dropping death from the clouds. The Australians fought the war that actually existed. A silent, patient, merciless war where the jungle itself was the judge. And the jungle had already chosen its side. Whitfield kept reading, the reports blurring together into one long horror story of excellence. Small 5-man SAS teams inserting deep, then simply disappearing for weeks. Enemy patrols walking straight past them at 3 meters and never knowing. Entire Viet Cong companies found dead in their bunkers with no bullet holes. Only throats cut in the dark. One patrol returning with documents from a regimental headquarters that American intelligence had been hunting for 6 months. And always the same cold footnote at the bottom of every report. Ratio achieved with minimal expenditure of ammunition. Primary weapons used, patience and terrain. Whitfield closed the folder. Outside the tent, the jungle screamed with night insects. Somewhere in that darkness, right now, a handful of men who smelled like rotting fish and moved like smoke were turning the entire province into their personal hunting ground. The numbers weren't statistics anymore. They had become legend. Cut to black and white archive-style footage recreated of SAS operators melting into green. Cut to a single abandoned enemy rifle lying in the mud, blood still wet. Cut to Whitfield's face, half in shadow, whispering to himself, 10-1 is war. 500-1 is something else. Something the American Army was never built to understand. 500 won. And the jungle kept the score. Captain Whitfield had seen many strange things by now. Men who smelled like death. Rucksacks wired to maim their friends. Kill ratios that broke mathematics. But nothing prepared him for the moment he first watched an Aboriginal tracker work. These weren't soldiers in the conventional sense. They were men whose people had been reading the Australian outback for 40,000 years, longer than most civilizations had even existed. When the SAS needed to understand the Vietnamese jungle better than the Viet Cong themselves, they didn't call for more satellites or drones. They called for men who could hear the earth speak. Whitfield stood at the edge of the small group, feeling like an intruder. The tracker, known only as Tracker Jack in after-action reports, never looked up. He simply knelt, pressed his palm flat against the laterite soil, closed his eyes for 3 seconds, then opened them and pointed. 2 men, heavy packs, moving slow, one limping. Passed here, sunrise yesterday. Whitfield glanced at the ground. To him it looked like ordinary dirt, scuffed, dry, nothing special. The SAS patrol leader nodded once. No questions. No doubt. They adjusted their route by 15 degrees and moved out 20 minutes later, straight toward where the tracker said the enemy would be resting. And they found them, exactly where he said, exactly how he said. This wasn't magic. It was memory encoded in generations. The Aboriginal trackers taught the SAS to see the jungle not as green chaos, but as a living document. Every bent blade of grass, every displaced pebble, every bird that suddenly went quiet wrote a sentence. A footprint pressed deeper on the outside edge equals man carrying weight on right leg. A leaf torn at shoulder height equals someone passed carelessly. Ants moving in a straight line across disturbed soil equals recent disturbance, less than 6 hours old. The way a vine hung slightly lower than its neighbors equals someone had brushed it moving fast. The Americans had technology that could map the entire province from orbit. The Australians had eyes that could read a single footprint, like a newspaper headline. And they combined the two. Whitfield watched one joint training session where an American recon platoon tried to follow a dummy Viet Cong trail laid by the trackers. The Americans lost it after 400 meters. The SAS, using only what the Aboriginals had shown them, followed it for 3 kilometers, then ambushed the enemy position from the perfect downwind angle. When it was over, one of the American sergeants walked up to Tracker Jack, removed his boonie hat, and simply said, "Sir, how?" Tracker Jack looked at him for the first time, smiled once, small, patient. "Land remembers." 3 words. Whitfield wrote them in his notebook that night. The land remembers. While the Pentagon spent billions trying to change the jungle, defoliants, bombs, roam plows, the Australians listened to it instead. They didn't conquer the terrain. They became fluent in its language. And fluency is a weapon sharper than any bayonet. Cut to recreated black and white shots of bare feet pressing into mud, stick tracing patterns. Cut to SAS operator mimicking the motion, eyes focused, learning. Cut to Whitfield's notebook page. The land remembers underlined twice. He finally understood why the Viet Cong feared these men more than napalm. It wasn't the rifles. It wasn't the traps. It was that the jungle had chosen sides, and the Australians were the only ones who could read its vote. 40,000 years of knowledge versus 20th century firepower. The jungle didn't care who had the bigger budget. Captain Whitfield had seen many things by now that made him question everything West Point had taught him. But nothing prepared him for the moment he first met the men who taught the SAS how to truly see the jungle. They weren't soldiers in conventional sense. They wore no rank. They carried no rifles most of the time. They were Aboriginal trackers, men whose ancestors had read the Australian outback for over 40,000 years. And now, they were teaching elite commandos how to hunt humans in another continent's green hell. These men didn't need maps. They didn't need compasses. They read the ground the way most people read a newspaper. A footprint pressed too deep meant the man was carrying extra weight, probably ammo or rice. A twig snapped at shoulder height meant someone careless had passed through in a hurry. Mud drying faster on one side of a print meant the foot had lifted in that direction only minutes ago. One tracker could look at a patch of disturbed earth the size of a dinner plate and tell you how many men walked there, whether they were carrying heavy loads, if they were tired, injured, or running, even their state of mind. Fear leaves a different stride pattern than confidence. The SAS didn't just listen to them. They studied under them like apprentices in some forgotten guild. Tracker noted irregular spacing in enemy boot prints. Indicated limping. Probable wound to right leg. Team adjusted ambush accordingly. Contact made 47 minutes later. 5 VC Kia. 0 friendly casualties. Whitfield sets the paper down. Looks out at the dark jungle beyond the sandbags. The Americans dropped defoliants to strip the trees bare. They flew helicopters so low the downdraft flattened grass for miles. They tried to force the jungle to reveal its secrets. The Australians did the opposite. They let the jungle teach them. They surrendered their ego to it. They became students of a knowledge that had no rank, no medals, no promotion board. And because of that humility, the jungle answered. Cut to an SAS patrol moving single file through triple canopy jungle. An Aboriginal tracker leads, not walking, gliding, every step deliberate. Cut to close-up of his hand brushing a leaf. He pauses, sniffs the air, then signals stop. Cut to the patrol freezes. 30 seconds later, a Viet Cong scout walks right past them, 8 feet away, oblivious. Cut to the tracker's face, calm, almost serene. No triumph, just certainty. This was the inversion the Americans could never accept. Technology was supposed to win wars. Firepower, air support, satellites. Yet here were men using skills older than gunpowder, and they were winning. The Viet Cong were masters of jungle too, but against the Aboriginal trained SAS, they suddenly felt hunted in their own house. Trees that once hid them now betrayed them. Footprints that once vanished now screamed. Silence that once protected them now felt like a noose tightening. The trackers didn't make the SAS invincible. They made them native, and in a war where the land itself was a battlefield, being native meant everything. Whitfield wrote in his private notes that night, "The white man came with machines to conquer the jungle. The black man came with eyes to become it." Guess who the jungle listened to? 40,000 years of knowledge versus 200 years of industrial war. The jungle already knew the winner. Captain Whitfield kept one thing on his desk until the day he retired, an Australian ace of spades, given to him by the same sergeant who first grabbed his arm and said those 4 words. For Americans, it was a trophy. For the SAS, it was a message. We were here. We are always here. And on the corner of that card was a small dark stain. He never asked what it was. Some questions are better left unanswered, because in the end, the rucksack wasn't about booby traps. It was about a choice. America brought the greatest military machine ever built. The Australians brought the willingness to become whatever the jungle demanded, no matter the cost. They became the ghosts. They became the hunters. They became the jungle's own immune system. And that is why, to this day, if you ever find yourself in a museum or an old fire base and you see a filthy, rotting Australian rucksack from Vietnam, you don't touch it. You don't ask questions. You walk away. Because inside isn't just canvas and wire. Inside is the end of innocence and the birth of something the world still doesn't fully understand. The ghosts are still watching. Do not touch their packs. Subscribe if you want the stories they tried to bury.